In our last couple videos, we looked at the difference between a population and a sample. We looked at the difference between an individual and a variable. And we looked at a couple different examples to help illustrate these concepts. We looked at some of the questions that were studied on the census, the race of an individual, the number of people in a household. We posed a hypothetical question about how many U.S. citizens go to college. Uh, Going all the way back to the first lesson, we talked about some of the variables of interest for an NBA team: the height, the weight of the players, the college that these players went to, their salary. The one commonality with all of these examples is the data is collected passively, okay, meaning we don't need to do anything really to our individuals to collect this data. The closest thing to manipulation I think we would get to is by measuring somebody's height or measuring their weight, but we're simply asking them to step on a scale and step off of the scale, okay? Whenever we collect data passively, by surveys or by asking questions or by not manipulating your individuals, that's called an observation. Okay, so an observation, again, I always think of as we are collecting data passively. And how do we do that again? Well, it's through sample surveys. Um, it's through interviews. It's through census. Okay, things like that are going to allow us to collect data passively, and we're observing. Right? Don't overcomplicate this. When we observe something, we just watch. We don't do anything else. We don't get involved. We just observe. Okay. Now, an experiment, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Okay. This is when I think of the word manipulate, and I don't want that to be confused with something that's negative. Okay. Manipulate. Um, we're just asking them to do something. It's something more action based. So we're manipulate our individuals. Okay, and we this phrase manipulating our individuals, statistically, we call that administering a treatment. And before we go on to a discussion about the treatment and what that looks like, if you want to think of observation as collecting data passively, manipulating our individuals, it would be like collecting data actively. Okay. Now, when I think of the word treatment, okay, and the treatment is the key to any experiment, there needs to be a treatment. Okay. When I think of that word, I think of medicine, right? If I wanted to study the effect of um, taking Tylenol on reducing a fever, right? I would want to conduct an experiment where maybe half of my individuals are taking nothing, and then the other half of them would be taking the Tylenol, and then I want to compare the effects. Okay, that would be a basic experiment because we're requiring one group of the individuals to take the medicine. But sometimes treatment can be given in the form of, um, we'll say, a program, okay, or it can also be, and what I mean by that, us elaborate on that program first. If I wanted to study the effects of, um, we'll say, online learning versus traditional learning, traditional like in class learning. This would not be an observation. This would be an experiment if I wanted to study. And actually, MIT did a study on this of what's more effective, online or traditional learning. And the way they set it up, they took, I believe it was 65 different courses at the institution, and in those 65 courses, some of them were assigned online learning modules, and others were assigned a traditional classroom experience. Now, the reason this is an experiment is the students did not have control over whether they were in the online learning module or they were in the traditional learning classroom. In that sense, they are being manipulated, and they're being, again, they're used actively to collect data on which program is more effective. Okay, so that would be an example where your treatment is kind of a program, or maybe even a better word would be process. Okay, that could also be a treatment. Another form of a treatment could actually be depriving, right, or deprivation of something that people are used to. For example, if I wanted to study the effects of sleep on performance in a statistic class, and for a week straight, the week leading up to the midterm, um, somehow manipulated half of the class to only obtain 4 hours of sleep a night, whereas the others were um, just doing their normal schedule, whether they have 8 hours of sleep a night or 6 hours or even just 2 hours. We left, say, 15 of those students um, unattended to, whereas the other 15 were closely monitored and required to only get 4 hours of sleep a night, and then study the results of how each group did on the midterm. This would be an example where you have an experiment where the treatment is actually depriving the individuals of something. Okay. Again, we'll go into more detail on experiments, but for now, the big idea is the difference between observation and experiment. Think of that difference between a passive and an active um, action, right? If we collect data passively, if we're not manipulating our subjects at all, that would be an observation. If we are collecting data actively and we're manipulating our individuals to a certain degree, that would be an experiment.